My aunt spent her entire life laughing at me, telling me I was useless. But years later, I was the one who bought her company and became her new boss. Now she's stripped of her power, working for me for a meager salary, and every day she sees success go to those she once humiliated. For me, this was real payback for the past. Hi, this is Arena of Revenge. Here you'll find exciting stories with gripping plots and vengeance. Follow us. I never thought fate could turn against me so abruptly, and then just as abruptly give me the chance to regain a sense of control. I grew up in a typical American suburb, where my parents worked almost non-stop, and I grew up in the shadow of my extended family. My aunt, who lived nearby, always loved to tease me, especially when I was a teenager. She was 10 years older than me, had a secure career at a local hardware store, and always seemed flawless to everyone. When we gathered for family celebrations, she never missed an opportunity to point out that I had no money, no influence, and no chance of a successful life. I remember her laughter, how it grated on my ears, when she told me that no one needed me and that I would never amount to anything. These words stuck in my head, but unlike many, I didn't fight them with aggression. I simply started working. After school, I got a small job at a local electronics store, where I learned everything about sales and communicating with people. I didn't complain. I studied the market, understood how companies worked, how negotiations were conducted, how contracts were drawn up. At the same time, I earned extra money on online platforms, creating small projects that brought in a little money, but most importantly, experience. By the age of 25, I had saved enough to start my own business, albeit small, but honest and stable. I did it gradually, without loans, without help, solely through my own efforts. All this time, my aunt couldn't hide her surprise whenever she accidentally heard about my successes. At first, she was simply surprised. Then she began whispering to other relatives, and then she started calling, asking trivial questions, as if trying to understand where I got it all. I didn't answer her calls, didn't invite her to the office. My business grew. I expanded, found clients that even she, with her experience, couldn't attract. And then a chain of events began that changed everything. A few months ago, her company ran into financial difficulties. She applied for bank loans, tried to cut costs and lay off staff, but every step only worsened the situation. I watched from afar, without interfering, although I occasionally learned of her problems from mutual friends and employees who knew about me. Then came an offer to sell the company. She could no longer cope with her debts and obligations, and an offer to sell the business appeared on the market. I saw this as an opportunity not only to invest, but also to test myself in a new field. The deal was complex. Negotiations lasted for weeks. I verified every detail, every obligation, every figure was worth its weight in gold. When the contract was signed and the funds were transferred, the company officially became my property. I went there on the first day to meet with the employees, familiarize myself with the processes, and understand what exactly needed to change to save the business and improve its performance. And that's when I heard her voice outside the office door. She was standing in the hallway, surprised and embarrassed at the same time, and said she would like to discuss the possibility of staying with me. I looked at her, the woman who had once laughed at me, humiliated me, and told me I was worthless. And now that same woman was asking me for a job. I felt a strange combination of emotions, satisfaction, pride, and a kind of quiet triumph, as if fate had repaid me for years of ridicule. I asked her under what conditions she wanted to work, and she began listing her expectations, skills, experience, everything she had once taken for granted. I listened and saw her shy away, trying to appear confident, but in her voice there was a recognition that she had been wrong about me, and that now I was the one holding the cards. I offered her the position, but with a new approach. She had to prove her worth, show that she was willing to work, not command, and most importantly, respect the path I had taken myself. In the first few days, she tried to maintain her usual demeanor, offering advice and mentoring employees, but gradually she began to realize that the rules had changed and that I was now in charge. Watching her transformation was strange, yet rewarding. I felt the past, long years of humiliation and ridicule, finally taking shape, and that she now depended on me, just as I once depended on the words and opinions of others. This gave me a sense of power I'd never experienced before, and one that simultaneously demanded wisdom and prudence from me, because I didn't want to simply take revenge. I wanted to prove to myself and to her that respect and success come through hard work, not by laughing at the weaknesses of others. With each passing day, she became part of the team, gradually coming to terms with the new order. I saw her attitude change, her arrogance disappear, and an understanding emerge that work requires effort, not the right to self-aggrandizement. And most importantly, I realized there's no point in rushing into emotions, revenge, or pride. All this time, I'd been building not only the business, but also my sense of power, my dignity, my place in life. And now, when she asks me for a job, I can decide calmly, without rushing, with the understanding that the rules are now in my favor. This moment became a symbol for me that patience, perseverance, and self-improvement can yield results that no one can take away, even if years ago they mocked and humiliated you. When news that my aunt's company was now mine began to reach other family members, I didn't expect things to unfold so sharply and dramatically. At first, my cousin, whom I used to be friends with, called, but now he started asking strange questions about how I could have bought the company without considering it a family business. I heard a mixture of surprise and envy in his voice, as if I'd broken some invisible code I'd never suspected. Then my aunt appeared with her requests, still trying to show she could be helpful, but now with a tinge of anxiety, because she saw that I wouldn't let her boss me around again. Relatives began whispering at family gatherings, discussing who should be the first to know who now owned the company, who had the right to influence, and who had a share in the profits. I tried to keep my distance, explaining to myself that this was my business and that family emotions shouldn't influence professional decisions, but the tension was mounting. My youngest aunt, who always considered herself smarter than everyone else, called asking to meet and discuss possible collaboration, though in reality it was an attempt to figure out how to extract some benefit. She tried to approach the conversation gently, smiling, saying that I was family and we should support each other. But I understood that behind her words was a test. She wanted to understand how much I was willing to compromise and who was now truly in control of the situation. I agreed to a meeting, but immediately set boundaries. Any discussions had to be concrete, without pressure, and strictly on the merits of the work. At that meeting, I felt for the first time that people who had previously laughed at or underestimated me were now trying to play on my emotions, but I wasn't going to let them do that. I watched their confidence crumble as they realized I was calmly answering questions and arranging the terms as I saw fit. After that meeting, more calls and meetings began, with all the relatives who could trying to discuss their interests. Some hinting at old debts, others at moral obligations that supposedly existed, although they had never been formally formalized. I listened, analyzed, and with each conversation, I felt that I was now in complete control of the situation. It was strange to see how the family's usual methods of pressure ceased to work. Even my aunt, who had laughed at me as a child, now tried to manage her behavior carefully, hiding her irritation and anxiety. She tried to drop into the office unannounced several times to have a civil conversation, but I immediately made it clear that the office had its own rules, and all employees were expected to respect them. This caused the first signs of tension among the staff. Some employees who had once worked directly with her and were accustomed to her bossy manner began to raise questions about how to properly perform their duties. I realized I had to tread carefully to maintain control, but also to avoid provoking open conflict. I began documenting everything that was happening, establishing new procedures and communication rules, explaining to everyone that the business was now under my management, and that personal family relationships could not affect the work. Meanwhile, my relatives continued to look for loopholes. Some hinted at old family agreements, others spoke of moral support, and still others tried to find out my plans for the company's development through mutual friends. It all seemed like an endless game with multiple levels, where the stakes were high and the rules changed depending on who was trying to influence the situation. My aunt, of course, was the most active. She started attending staff meetings, trying to offer advice, even when I explicitly stated that this was my responsibility and that only I could make decisions. I noticed her eyes darting around the office from time to time, as if searching for allies among the staff, but most had become accustomed to me being in charge and viewed her interventions with cautious irony. At family celebrations and gatherings, the situation became almost unbearable. Family discussions always began with easy questions about health, the weather, and the children, and ended with caustic remarks about, "How come you bought the company and we didn't?" Or, "Aren't you afraid of running someone else's business?" I remained silent, listening, analyzing their reactions, and each time I noticed how people changed under my calm supervision. Even my eldest aunt, who had always been uncompromising and said that business was only for the strong and smart, now tried to choose her words carefully, afraid of offending me. It was an amazing feeling. Those who had previously tried to appear superior to me now grew nervous, chose their words carefully, and sought allies. Inside, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and caution. On the one hand, it was nice to see the situation turn around, but on the other, I understood that two drastic steps could ruin family relationships, which, though strained, were still important. I began to strategize how to maintain control of the company without completely severing contact with my relatives. After all, they were a part of my life, and I didn't want to ignore them completely. I watched my aunt and other relatives try to accommodate me, but their methods were increasingly failing. Attempts to manipulate, insist on old rights, and exploit emotions. All of this was now met with calm resistance and clear boundaries. And the longer this game went on, the more I realized that the power was now in my hands, and respect must be earned, not demanded. I began to use this to change not only the company's internal processes, but also my family relationships, demonstrating in practice that respect comes through actions, not through grandiose words and past achievements. The situation grew increasingly tense. Relatives tried to unite, discussing who could influence me, who could reclaim their old status. But I acted calmly, documented the facts, established clear rules, and gradually the tension turned to recognition. Now everyone understood that control and decisions were mine, and that the chances of manipulating me were minimal. This period became a true test not only of my business, but also of my nerves, endurance, and ability to maintain sanity when everyone around me was trying to play the old games of power, envy, and influence. And I understood that all of this wasn't just business decisions, but a real family drama where the stakes were trust, respect, and the right to manage what I had created with my labor. Every day revealed new moments, when relatives tried to pull off something covert, when my aunt looked at me trying to find a loophole, when cousins whispered among themselves, trying to figure out what decisions I would make. All this made my life intense, eventful, and at the same time surprisingly interesting, because for the first time, I felt I could truly influence events, that I could build my life and my business independent of old grievances and ridicule. Now, every step was a test of me, my strength, my endurance, and my ability to manage not only the company but also my family relationships, which had always previously seemed complicated and tense to me. And at that moment, I realized the real struggle wasn't over. It was just beginning, and that every new day would bring new tests, new intrigues, new attempts by my relatives to regain their influence. But now I held all the cards, and every action, every word was my opportunity to show who was really in charge and who deserved respect. The situation with my relatives began to escalate almost immediately after I bought the company and established new work rules. One of my aunt's key clients, with whom she had long-term agreements, suddenly started calling me directly, inquiring about the terms of the partnership and declaring that things were handled differently before. I sensed tension when my aunt tried to intervene in the call, as if trying to show the client that she was still the dominant voice in the company. I gently but firmly set the boundaries. All negotiations would now go through me, and previous agreements would need to be adjusted to align with the new management. The next day, my cousin, who had never previously shown any interest in business, came to the office but now declared that he wanted to participate in negotiations with potential partners because he's family and knows how things work. His tone was polite, almost friendly, but I could see that behind his words was an attempt to manipulate and protest my decisions. I agreed to participate, but immediately clarified that he would observe and that I would make the decisions. During the negotiations, he tried to interject his comments, adjust proposals, and even offered discounts to the client, citing the family's long-standing relationship with the company. The client looked at me, clearly trying to figure out who was in charge, and I realized that this time I had to act calmly but decisively to establish my authority. I allowed my cousin to speak, but each time carefully steered the conversation toward my terms, emphasizing that any decisions were now my own, not based on old family habits. After the negotiations, my cousin tried to explain to my aunt and other relatives that he helped me, but I realized they were trying to make it seem as if I depended on their support, as if this was part of their strategy. The first signs of open discontent began to appear in the office. Employees accustomed to my aunt began asking why she no longer handled matters herself, who was in charge now, and why things had been different before. I organized meetings, explained the new procedures and rules in detail, and demonstrated how to now interact with clients. Gradually, the atmosphere stabilized, but each day brought new attempts by relatives to interfere. My aunt was especially active. She tried to discreetly call clients, offer her own terms, and discuss contract details without my knowledge. I discovered this by accident while checking correspondence and phone calls, and each time I found myself having to gently but firmly explain that any such actions were unacceptable. One day, she arranged a meeting with a key supplier, without warning me or coordinating it, to review the situation with delivery terms. I arrived at the meeting and saw her begin to expound on her old methods, assuming I would listen and accept her recommendations. I let her speak for a few minutes, listened attentively, took notes, and then calmly, without emotion, began to adjust the conversation, demonstrating that I was now the decision maker, that the terms were being discussed jointly with my specialists, and that any actions without my knowledge were no longer possible. The supplier was slightly surprised, but realized I was now in charge and agreed to the new terms. My aunt, sensing that her strategy hadn't worked, looked embarrassed but tried to maintain her composure, as if everything was fine. This incident became a signal to the rest of the relatives. They began to intervene more cautiously, but simultaneously tried to find other loopholes. Some wrote letters offering advice. Others tried calling clients directly under various pretexts, and still others discussed the old ways with employees. Every time I encountered such attempts, I documented the facts, organized meetings, explained the new rules, and demonstrated that all decisions now went through me and that interference was unacceptable. With each such event, I felt my confidence grow, my authority building, but at the same time, my caution increased. I had to act in a way that didn't completely destroy my relationships with my relatives. After all, they were part of my life, and their influence couldn't be completely ignored. At one point, the situation reached the point where my aunt arranged a secret meeting with one of the major clients, trying to convince him that the old ways were better. I learned of this from an employee who overheard the conversation and realized I needed to take decisive action. I invited the client to a meeting, explained the new work rules, showed them the entire company's structure, my decisions, and everyone's responsibilities. The client understood that any further negotiations would now go through me. My aunt remained silent, but I saw her look, a mixture of irritation, embarrassment, and perhaps recognition that she was no longer in charge. This was crucial. I understood that the relatives could no longer directly interfere with the business, but they continued to seek workarounds, discussing it among themselves, developing their own strategies, trying to protest and test boundaries. At family gatherings, conversations constantly veered toward the company. Someone tried to insult me with a word, someone made jokes, someone sought support from other relatives to influence decisions. I listened, analyzed, observed reactions, and demonstrated that any attempts at pressure were not working. The situation became a true test of my nerves, my ability to manage while remaining calm, as every intervention from my family is a minor crisis that must be quickly resolved without unnecessary emotion. And with each step, I realized that power and control were now completely in my hands, that I could calmly manage the company, set rules, and protect the interests of the business, despite the fact that old habits, family expectations, and attempts at manipulation still reigned. But at the same time, I understood that this was not the end. Relatives continued to seek loopholes, test boundaries, attempt to influence through employees, clients, and acquaintances. And every day brought new challenges that required endurance, analysis, and the ability to maintain a balance between business rigor and family diplomacy. This game, this struggle for influence and control, became an integral part of my life, and I realized that the real test was only just beginning, because now it was not enough to simply run the business. I also needed to manage the relationships within the family, which had always been complex and tense, and which now influenced every step, every decision, and every meeting with clients and partners. Once I had firmly secured control of the company, I realized that simply stripping my aunt of her power wouldn't be enough. I wanted to ensure that every workday reminded her that she was now under my command, and that the entire team saw that her time as boss was over. I began with the simplest, and at the same time, most painful step for her, an official redistribution of roles. I called my aunt into my office and gave her a contract that clearly outlined her job responsibilities. Unlike her previous status, where she was the face of the company, handling all key issues, meeting with clients and suppliers, her contract now included a list of tasks related to internal processes, monitoring reporting, assisting junior staff, and maintaining documentation. This was the level of work she had always considered second-rate, delegating to secretaries and junior specialists. I watched her read the document, her fingers trembling and her expression changing from surprise to indignation. But she had no choice, either sign or lose her job, and with her damaged reputation in the market, it was unlikely anyone would hire her. She signed, gritting her teeth, and that moment became the turning point for me, the moment when I first felt true triumph. Then I began systematically building a team. First, I focused on the employees my aunt had always underestimated. One of the sales managers, a young man, was always her go-to guy. She considered him incapable of handling major deals. I gave him a chance, assigned him a project involving a new client, and he handled it brilliantly. I specifically arranged a meeting where I publicly praised his work, emphasizing that he was the one who brought in the new contract. My aunt sat nearby, forced to listen as I exalted the one she herself called the weak link. I saw her eyes drop, and it brought me almost physical pleasure. Gradually, I began promoting other employees she had belittled. I gave them authority, trust, and the opportunity to prove themselves. Every success they achieved was like a stab in her back, because it shattered her belief that only she knew how to run things. For me, it was a subtle but very sweet act of revenge. I didn't yell or openly humiliate her. I simply showed that her assessment of people and her authority no longer meant anything. She found herself in a position where her voice no longer carried weight, and those she had once pushed away now looked down on her. I made sure my aunt couldn't escape this pressure. I didn't fire her, though she probably expected it. I kept her at the company, but in a position where every day was a reminder that she was bereft of power. She wrote reports that I now reviewed personally, and every time I found errors, I took the opportunity to point them out at a staff meeting, in a dry, business-like tone, of course, without emotion, but so that everyone understood. The former leader was now making trivial mistakes. I saw the employees exchanging glances, and how for them this became confirmation that times had changed. I could taste this power, the taste of long-awaited payback for years of ridicule and humiliation. It was especially gratifying to watch her struggle to maintain her composure. She came to work in expensive suits, trying to appear confident, pretending that everything was under control. But behind this facade, I saw growing despair. Each new day for her became a struggle for the remnants of dignity, and this was precisely what gave me inner satisfaction. She tried to find loopholes, talk to clients, hint that she still had connections, but I rebuffed these attempts firmly and calmly. One time, she came to me with an offer to lead negotiations with a long-standing partner of the firm, explaining that he knew her well. I looked at her coldly and said I had a more suitable candidate, and I invited the very employee she had once called inexperienced. He did an excellent job, and we signed a lucrative contract. My aunt was present at the meeting, sitting silently, and every time I saw her gaze, I felt that long-awaited revenge, quiet but very powerful. At family gatherings, I never missed an opportunity to highlight the firm's successes. I talked about new clients, new employees who were growing, about the results we had achieved. I presented all this calmly, without unnecessary pathos, but in such a way that everyone understood. The successes belonged to me, not hers. The relatives listened, some silent with envy, others feigning joy, while my aunt sat and nodded, as if trying to hide her own defeat. But I saw her inner state, and this was exactly what I had worked for so many years. I had deliberately made her salary fixed and lower than that of the top managers I had promoted. I wanted her to feel the blow every time she received her paycheck, to understand that those she had once humiliated were now earning more than her, and she could do nothing about it. In her eyes, I saw a mixture of hatred and despair, but also the recognition that she no longer had power. She was forced to work under me, forced to do what I told her to do, and I reminded her of this every day. For me, this was a true triumph, a true revenge, but at the same time, everything was completely legal and professional. I had done nothing to cling to. It all looked like a routine business reorganization, but deep down I knew it was my revenge, my payback for all those years when she laughed and said no one needed me. Now she was needed only by me, and only on the terms I dictated. When the company finally got back on its feet and began generating a stable profit, I decided to see it through. My goal wasn't simply to show my aunt that I was stronger, not simply to put her in her place. I wanted her every workday to be a reminder that she no longer had any say in anything, that her power and status were a thing of the past, and the entire system she'd built, and in which she felt like a queen, now belonged to me. The simplest and most painful way to do this was to redistribute funds. I called a meeting with all the key employees and announced a new bonus system. Now, rewards were directly linked to results and contracts signed. Everything was transparent, everything was by the rules, with no loopholes. I emphasized that I wanted to incentivize those who truly worked, who brought value to the company, not those who were just there for the sake of status. I saw the employees' faces change. Some perked up, others became wary, while my aunt sat there with a stony expression. She was well aware that this system was taking away her last remaining cards. Previously, she had always been able to influence bonus distribution, giving more money to those loyal to her, but now everything depended not on her, but on the numbers. And she knew the numbers would clearly not be in her favor. When the first payments under the new system began, the picture became even more stark. The very same guy she considered a loser received a bonus greater than her salary. The girl she'd constantly overwhelmed with routine work earned double her salary after closing a deal with a new client. People she'd humiliated for years were now earning amounts she could only dream of. Meanwhile, her own salary remained fixed and modest, with no bonuses or participation in distributions. She earned less than those who'd once stood up when she showed up. It was a special pleasure for me to see her familiar world crumble, to see her receive a check every month that reminded her of her new role. I deliberately made the pay system as transparent as possible. Every employee knew how much they earned, and a new hierarchy was forming before everyone's eyes. Successful managers rose to the top, while Auntie sank lower and lower. She tried to save face, but I could see how it was destroying her. A particularly poignant moment was when we gathered everyone for a company party. I brought up a table of quarterly results on the screen. Auntie's name was at the bottom of the list, her contribution minimal and her pay laughable. And at the top, shining above, were the very people she had despised and pushed away. I thanked them, presented them with bonuses, and applauded along with the audience. My aunt sat at her desk, silent, and trying not to look at the screen, but I saw her clenched fists and the difficulty she had in breathing. At that moment, I realized that her revenge had achieved its goal. I didn't humiliate her with words. I didn't yell or remind her of her previous mockery. I simply let the facts speak for themselves. The numbers, the contracts, the income, all of it showed who was boss now, and it was undeniable. The most terrifying thing for her was that no one saw her as an authority anymore. The employees who had once fussed over her now didn't even get up from their seats when she walked in. They looked at her like an ordinary clerk, and sometimes even made disparaging jokes behind her back. And I didn't stop them, because I thought it was fair. She had treated others this way for years, and now it was her time to experience what it meant to be at the bottom. Her family couldn't help but notice the changes, too. At family gatherings, I increasingly talked about my successes, showed off figures, and told her about new partners. Everyone knew the company was growing, and they knew I was behind it. But my aunt sat nearby, silent, and no one asked her advice anymore. In fact, some even began to joke about her now working for me. I saw how hurt she was, and it pleased me to watch how her own weapons, ridicule and contempt, were now turned against her. In the end, I did for her what she feared most. I deprived her not only of money, but also of respect. She remained at the bottom of the ladder with a small salary, no voice, no opportunity to influence anything. Every day she came to the office and performed routine tasks, while around her life boiled, in which she no longer played any role. For me, this was the ending I'd been waiting for. I didn't want to fire her. That would have been too easy. I wanted her to remember every day what she said when she laughed at me, when she said no one needed me. Now she herself found herself in a situation where no one listened to her, no one feared her, and no one respected her. She had become a nobody, and that was my ultimate triumph.